David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
One of the things you've heard me say many times on the show, if you've been watching or listening for any period of time, is that we are just genuinely really bad at predicting recessions. Some people have been predicting a recession for the last 5 years. Some have been saying it's 6 months away. Others, it's 12 months away. Others, it's 18 months away. And we're really just terrible at predicting when the next recession is going to be. But one of the things we do know is that we are one day closer today than we were yesterday to the next recession. That's just sort of a reality unless you believe that something so fundamental has changed that there will never be a recession again. And if you're making that case, well, I'd love to hear why that's what you believe. Number two, we do know that there are certain signals that we can look at that will tell us whether we are imminently closer to a recession. We're still not very good at predicting the future state of the economy at any particular point in time, but we actually increasingly have indicators that suggest we are getting closer and closer to the next recession. The latest being that the yield curve has inverted. If you have no idea what that means, fear not. I am going to explain it to you, hopefully in terms that will make it clear to everybody, even if this is not in your educational or personal interest background. So don't worry about that. But before we get to that, some of the other signals we've seen recently that are of concern. There's one that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it is important, which is that the number of people, the percentage of people who are 90 days or more behind on car payments has been going up, up, up. And this is really important because it seems sort of innocuous and esoteric in some way. 90 plus days behind on car payments. What does that tell us about the state of the economy? Car payments and car loans tell us a lot about the degree of financial stress on people, because to fall 30 days behind on a car payment because you had an unexpected expense, okay. To fall 60 days behind, okay. But when people become 90 or more days behind on car payments, cars that they presumably need to get to work and earn money, that they need to get their kids to school or whatever else the case may be, that starts to be a red flag about the personal financial situation of many, many people in the United States. That's been a red flag. Number two, the stock market erraticism as a result of Donald Trump's trade war, including basically the markets being back down to where we were a year and a half ago, does not bode particularly well for the future of the economy. And then now, yesterday, the yield curve has inverted. What does that mean and why do we care? If you don't understand it, it's hard to see it as a red alert. So let's try to dig into it so we can all understand what I'm talking about. In general, in the world of money, in order to potentially earn a higher and higher return, you either need to accept more risk, the risk of losing money, or tie up your money for longer periods of time. So if you look at CDs, a certificate of deposit you can get with a bank or financial institution, if you're willing to lock your money up for a year, you say, take my money, I can't touch it for a year, you might be offered a 2% return on your CD. These are hypothetical numbers, by the way. But if you're willing to say, I will lock my money up for 2 years, you can, in principle, earn a higher return. Maybe it's a 3% return instead of a 2% return because you're giving up access to the money for a longer period of time. This is the way things typically work, because if you were able to earn 2% on a 1 year or a 2 year CD, most people would pick the 1 year CD because it's a shorter lockup period. So along the same lines, normally when you look at the 10-year U.S. Treasury bond, the interest rate yield on that is higher than the yield on the 2-year U.S. Treasury bond, basically for the same reasons that I just discussed. There's now been an inversion of the yield curve where the 10-year U.S. Treasury bond, briefly, and this fluctuates all the time, had a lower yield than the 2-year bond. This is a marker with a very strong correlation to recessions. If you look at the last 7 recessions going back to 1969, all 7 were preceded by the 10-year bond yield dropping below the 2-year bond yield. And as you might remember, the Fed recently lowered rates with the idea in part of keeping the 10-year bond yielding more than the 2-year U.S. Treasury bond. But the continued chaos with the Chinese trade war that Donald Trump is waging and other things have been an opposing force. And indeed, the 10-year yield has dropped below the 2-year yield. So why does this matter so much? The 10-year Treasury bond is considered a very reliable safe haven for investor money. The 10-year bond, if you believe in the general future stability of the economy, is a very safe place to put money. When the 10-year bond yields less than the 2-year bond, it signals that there is a very negative outlook about the future of the economy in the next few years. Why? Because investors are so scared about the 2-year outlook that they prefer to take the guaranteed return on the 10-year bond, even if it's less, to such a degree that it ends up bidding down the yield because it is seen as safer and more favorable for traders and for markets and for the economy. And it effectively creates a feedback loop where, because of the lower yield, banks become less willing to lend money, which further causes an economic slowdown. And like much of this stuff, these feedback loops go on and on and on, and who knows where they stop. So understand a few things. Number one, none of this changes that the economy doesn't work for tens of millions of people in the United States, maybe even hundreds of millions. That's understood. I'm still a social democrat. I'm not jumping into finance bro mode or anything like that. That's one thing to understand. Number two, we are always heading to the next recession. The question is when. And number three, increasingly the indicators say that it's going to be soon. And we actually know of specific Trump policy that's pushing us closer. Think back to 2012. Before the 2012 election, Obama versus Romney, they both made claims about the economy. The reality was that indicators were pretty good at the time, and the economy was likely to remain pretty good, no matter who was elected president in 2012. I said it at the time, it remained true. We now actually have White House policy that is specifically precipitating the next recession, led by the disastrous trade war, and we are starting to see more and more indicators of that. I want to hear from you. Let me know what you think, and we will certainly do a follow-up and continue to keep an eye on that yield curve. We've heard really stupid arguments from climate science deniers on Fox News before. That's nothing new. We've heard, oh, it's cold in winter in North Dakota. Clearly, there's no climate change. We've heard, oh, plants breathe carbon dioxide, so more of it must be good. We've heard, oh, a senator threw a snowball in the Senate in winter. Climate change clearly is fake. But they are now starting to actually get angry and frustrated on Fox News that all these stupid liberals actually believe climate change is a problem, or better said, accept the science on the issue of climate change. Check out this totally unintelligible and quite frankly moronic rant from Pete Hegseth on Fox News.
The biggest national security threat, according to Bernie Sanders, is climate change.
The left says it all the time. This is what they believe. It is their religion. They want to fight the weather. The rest of us want to deal with real threats that want to take away our freedoms. Think about 4 years ago. What was that, 2015? ISIS was still, this was during Obama's term. ISIS was still a huge problem. The caliphate was there. President Trump ran on destroying ISIS, which he did to their physical caliphate. Now, there's remnants that we need to be concerned about today. That's taking on a real threat directly. Whether it's hot or cold, the enemy is here as far as liberals are concerned, and it's all about control for them. That's why climate change is the perfect enemy. They get to control your life to deal with it no matter what's happening.
Yeah.
Can you imagine being so out of touch with reality that when you see the left wanting to deal with climate change, a crisis today, you think it's about liberals wanting to control the lives of people? Like, can you imagine a dumber and less informed take on this issue other than maybe climate change is a hoax created by China? Again, the weather versus climate trope surfaces again. This couldn't be more clear. They are frustrated that the left understands and believes, and more importantly, accepts science. They are mad that the left isn't falling for their propaganda the way that many of their own viewers have fallen for it. They actually talk about belief in climate change as if it's like belief in God. You either have faith in it or you don't, but there's no knowable objective reality. And unfortunately for many Fox News viewers, maybe God is more real than climate change in terms of how they view this concept of belief and faith in, which is genuinely scary and maybe a conversation for a different day. But I actually think that the whole concept of belief is a misnomer. You can accept or not accept the science, but belief and faith is actually irrelevant to the reality. We shouldn't let them use this language around these issues because it blurs the lines between belief in God and belief in science. Science is a process. You can accept it or not. You can understand it or not, but it simply is. It is not pseudo-religious in the way that Pete Hegseth is talking about. Fox is mad that people accept empirical evidence over Fox's anti-science propaganda. That's fundamentally what this is about. And listen, it's not just Bernie saying climate change is a national security threat. The Pentagon agrees. The military gets it. We've talked about their assessments. When the Pentagon says, we see this as such a serious issue that we're going to lay out a plan to fight climate change for national security reasons, it's real. They are the extremists on Fox News. When you look at acceptance of climate change around the world, American right-wingers aren't just out of place in the United States or out of touch in the United States. They're out of place around the world. Even right-wing parties in most other countries accept climate change and human effect on climate change. American conservatives are truly the bizarre, crazy outliers who simply won't. And yes, Bernie's right. Climate change is a national security threat, but the anti-science right-wingers are also a security threat, and we're fighting them at the same time. Let me know your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show, and I hope that you will follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/DavidPakman, where you can use your Amazon Prime subscription to sign up to my channel with Twitch Prime. It costs you nothing, but it counts as a paid subscription for us, and I hope you'll do that.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Matthew Brust and Paul Shaughnessy. Thanks, guys. I really do appreciate your support, and I hope that you'll stay members for the next 5 years. Someone who's already 5 years in is Wesley Michelle. Wesley Michelle has been a member for almost 5 years. Join all of these great people at www.joinpakman.com. Takes under a minute to sign up. We keep 97.1% of every payment. All we pay is a 2.9% processing fee. Way more of the money stays with us than with any other way that you can support us. And you can save 40% if you use the coupon code THISIS2020. It's time for Hatriot Mail. A lot of focus, a lot of reaction to my segment last week. Am I Hispanic? Am I Latino? Am I just a white guy? And this week's Hatriot focuses on that. But first, a quick reminder, what is Hatriot Mail anyway?
Because if you aren't pro-life, you deserve the death penalty. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
Like with many weeks, this week's Hatriot Mail needs no more introduction than to say that a lot of people, beyond me saying that a lot of people were extremely triggered by learning that, yes, I am an immigrant to the United States from Latin America. Take a listen to this.
David, you are a Hispanic Latinos. Just accept it. Yet another great reason why you should never have been allowed in. I know you want to be white, but sadly for you, no, no, no. You can speak Spanish as much as you want, but no can do here. You will never be American.
I am Hispanic Latinos, and speaking Spanish is something that we really need to be looking into very, very much more. I don't really have much more to say about it. I think it really speaks for itself. The only thing I will remind you of is that the best way to fight patriotism in your own community is to use the coupon code Hatriot40 when you become a member on our website, joinpakman.com. The coupon code Hatriot40 saves you 40%. You get 100% of the member benefits. And it's a big double middle finger to the Hatriots, which we just love and encourage. So please sign up at joinpacman.com. Apply the coupon code Hatriot40. Do the right thing. Fight hatriotism in your local community. Usually when we talk about how the 2020 Democratic primary is looking, we talk about national polls. And in national polls, Joe Biden has and is leading, followed by Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who have sort of been trading off second and third place. But that's national polling. And in practice, the primaries don't happen all at once. They don't happen all on one day. The first caucus is February 3rd in Iowa. The first primary is February 11th in New Hampshire. And so New Hampshire is a very important early state in setting the tone of the primaries. But at the same time, we don't want to give New Hampshire more importance than it actually has, because remember that in 2016, Bernie Sanders handily won the New Hampshire primary over Hillary Clinton, but ultimately was not the Democratic nominee. So let's look at New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, there is a new poll that is getting a lot of attention in which Bernie Sanders has passed Joe Biden. The poll is from Gravis. Biden has been leading every New Hampshire poll dating all the way back to who even knows? I mean, a long time, dating to before he even announced that he was actually running. And now we have one new poll in which Bernie Sanders has passed Biden, sort of. Bernie Sanders at 21, Joe Biden at 15, but the poll has a 6.2% margin of error, and only 250 primary voters were actually asked their view on who they will vote for in the primary. So in reality, again, I'm just the messenger here. I'm just looking at what's on the screen. In reality, even though Bernie Sanders is leading Joe Biden by 6, the poll has a 6.2% margin of error, and it is a statistical tie. So some people are maybe making more of a big deal out of this poll than they should. This is one poll within the margin of error, but the trend has been a clearly anti-Biden trend in New Hampshire. Now, some other important caveats. I'm not being positive or negative. I'm not a Biden guy. I'm a Bernie Warren guy. I'm just being a realist. New Hampshire is Vermont's neighbor. Bernie is from New Hampshire. Winning New Hampshire in 2020 would not really be a sign of anything for Bernie Sanders, in the sense that he crushed Hillary there in the 2016 primary, 60-38, and ultimately lost the nomination. I would actually go further. If Bernie Sanders doesn't win New Hampshire on February 11th of 2020, it's probably a really bad sign for him in the 2020 Democratic primary, because it is a state that he so easily won in 2016. So this is valuable in showing us a trend line. It's valuable in that every primary is worth some delegates, and the more you win, the more delegates you have towards the nomination. We just don't want to give more value to this one poll in one state that Bernie won in 2016 anyway than it deserves. Now, there's another interesting data point from this poll when it comes to electability and the matchups versus Trump. New Hampshire voters say they'd vote for Bernie over Trump 51-41, and for Biden over Trump by an even bigger margin, 53-40. This is interesting because if you look back at 2016, in the general, Hillary Clinton won New Hampshire, but she won by 0.37%. If the Democratic candidate wins New Hampshire in 2020, doesn't matter who it is at this point, by 3, by 4, by 6, by 10, by 13, the way this poll is suggesting, this would be a massive signal in terms of the broader election. But that being said, it's early. Both of these margins, 51-41 and 53-40, they include like 7 to 8% undecided or third-party voters. That is not going to be the reality by Election Day. But even if all of the currently undecided and third-party voters shift to Trump by Election Day, these would still be bigger wins in 2020 in New Hampshire than Hillary Clinton had, and it could be a pretty big signal for 2020. It's all speculative. It's all hypothetical. It's very early. Everyone must vote no matter what you think is likely to happen in your state. Assume everybody should operate under the belief, which may end up not being wrong, that every state could be 50-50 and your vote could make the difference. I mean, literally speaking, that's not going to be the case, but that's the attitude every single one of us needs to have. I'll be voting in the primary. I'll be voting in the general, even though I vote here in Massachusetts. Once again, as far as New Hampshire is concerned, this is one poll, relatively small sample size, statistical tie. Nothing can be assumed. Every vote has to be cast and counted. My question for you today relates to the quality of the campaign that Joe Biden is running. Does anybody in my audience think that Joe Biden is running a good campaign? So I'm not asking you about electability. I'm not asking you about whether you agree with him on the issues. What I'm asking is, as far as campaign strategy and visibility and logistics and debate strategy are concerned, does anyone in my audience believe that Joe Biden is running a strong campaign? I don't see it. I want to hear from you. Make sure you're following us on Instagram at David Pakman Show. And while you're there, follow me on Instagram at david.pakman for the latest urban farming tomato update. Big updates, big news there. Check it out. We'll take a quick break and talk to you in a moment.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome back to the program Anthony Fantano, the internet's busiest music nerd and editor-in-chief of The Needle Drop. And I guess, Anthony, like sort of a little bit to my surprise, more and more involved in the political space. Not surprised. I know you, so I know you are a political guy. But, you know, that sometimes people who aren't working directly in politics want to stay away from it for business reasons, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that I found not too long ago the more that I found myself ranting about it on social media, the more it wasn't so much a big deal. I mean, of course, still to this day, I do catch a lot of responses that are like, just stick to music. But I found like about a 1-to-1 correlation between people who say that and people who actually disagree with what I'm saying. So it's interesting to find that the people who just don't want me to talk about politics are the ones who just don't want to hear the point of view that I'm espousing, as opposed to, you're the music guy, you shouldn't be talking about this or that or the other thing.
I feel like on this issue, I am basically like a just libertarian in the sense that I am completely fine with anyone using whatever platform they've built for themselves to talk about whatever they want, and the free market of ideas will dictate whether there are repercussions to that speech. Like if you have a basketball player who says, I'm going to use my celebrity to, at every opportunity, courtside interview, locker room interview, whatever, to talk about politics, that's great. And if I'm so turned off by their politics that I say, I'm not going to go and see the team play in person or whatever, that's actually like a free market reaction. And I would not, whether it's a celebrity or someone like you who's built their platform initially on music. I mean, I think it's great, and people can decide how they want to deal with someone's political views, period.
Yeah, and specifically when it comes to politics, I feel like every person has a responsibility to be engaged in the political process and what's going on with how our country is being run, no matter what president is in power around that time. And I suppose I'm libertarian about it, as you just said. I mean, anybody can use their platform to talk about any issue that they're passionate about. Sure, absolutely. But like I said, in my experience, and also as you just said there with the sports example, it seems like consistently there is this narrative coming from the right of just stay in your lane, shut up and dribble, don't be talking about this, that, or the other thing. And I don't know, for me personally, and I understand why other people would be attracted to it, it's a difficult subject to stay away from, not only because there are a lot of horrible things going on that are worth talking about, but on top of that, our politicians usually aren't addressing these issues as boldly as they should, not only through legislation, but through engagement with the electorate, through speeches, social media, PR events, that sort of thing. And I think that leaves open a huge vacuum in which people are dying for some kind of acknowledgement or validation from their officials, from their higher ups, from their leaders of, this is not normal, right? There's something wrong with this. This is kind of crazy. Things could be different. Things could be better. And sure, there are politicians this newer wave of them coming out now, like AOC and who they refer to as the Squad, and of course Bernie's been at it for a long time, and I think that voices like Elizabeth Warren has been speaking on a lot of these issues for a long time too. But these people still make up a very small fraction of the larger base of senators and congressmen and public officials that we have elected to government and are working on our behalf allegedly every single day.
So what do you make right now of the intersection that exists, to the extent that it exists, between culture, and I include music and gaming and movies and all of these things in there, and the political world? Because at the sort of highest level, like when you think of Trump, it's like, okay, the guy is known for being a reality host more than anything else to people around the world and in the United States, at least before being president. The notable interactions he's had with the sort of music and cultural world. Recently, we had this A$AP Rocky thing in Sweden. He famously had Kim Kardashian convince him about, the release of someone from prison. Although at a more systemic level, he's been, pretty milquetoast as far as what he's done, with one sort of exception in one bill that he passed. What is your interpretation of the interplay and the overlap that right now exists between the space you primarily occupy and the presidency and the political world?
God, it's a weird mix of everything. I mean, as far as music goes, I grew up listening to music that has a lot of political overtones to it. I mean, I enjoy a lot of pop music as well, but some of my favorite artists growing up were bands like Rage Against the Machine, whose lyrics I dove pretty deeply into. Even as a kid, got this sense of unfairness and corruption and corporate power influencing our government in a negative way. But I would say that we're not getting as many messages from mainstream music these days as we could along those lines, or just political messages in general, because of how volatile music careers and the music industry tends to be these days, through streaming, through the sheer saturation of artists that are in the limelight at any given time, through the risk that any artist is putting themselves at by coming out with a song that has a political message on it that might not necessarily hit or resonate with an audience. I mean, it does happen every once in a while. I'm sure that you've heard that Childish Gambino song, This Is America. And,
of course.
Glover has been doing quite a bit lately to interject a little more politics and messaging in his songs that he's been dropping as of late. But still, it's rare that you're catching music in the mainstream that has any kind of political overtone to it. And I would say it's even harder to come across these days than it was when I was much younger, especially when hip hop used to be a lot more politically charged and speak to, class and racial and economic struggles of whatever places those artists were coming from around that time.
Do you
those
think
narratives
that it's genuinely a risk in the sense? So, okay, I think back to the Dixie Chicks in whenever it was, that I don't even believe, and I'm sure you'll correct me, I don't recall that the content of their album was political, but they said, by the way, we're against the Iraq War and we don't like George Bush. And this was a huge
here's
problem.
the thing. It's not a risk in that sense, right? In the way that their career essentially got halted by their audience turning against them at that point. It's more of a risk of people tuning out. There's no section of the hip hop audience, honestly, that is going to attack their favorite artists if they come out with some anti-Trump song. But because of how a lot of people go to music merely for entertainment, and how social media has, I think, offloaded and become a bit of a pressure release valve for a lot of people's political and social opinions, when people are listening to their new artists, their new favorite artist's latest record, they just want to hear something that they could vibe to. They want to hear something that's going to allow them to escape from all of the horrible things that they're dealing with day to day. Being faced with harsh realities and bold political opinions isn't always something most people are looking to hear. Your general audience member, when they want to basically just put on something that they can have a good time to, unfortunately. I wish it was different. I wish it was flipped. But I think the risk that artists are taking is that their fans could tune out and just go listen to something else that is going to fit into the mood that they're trying to feed by putting on a record that they, just want to give themselves a bit of background music to just relax to, I guess.
There does seem to be some sort of unique interest from a lot of people just in the general public in knowing the political views of people that they follow. I think that if I remember the story right, Garth Brooks had been invited to perform at Trump's inauguration and didn't. But then when he was asked about it, he said it wasn't a political statement. It was a scheduling conflict, which was then reinterpreted as, oh, he's saying he gladly would have done it and he is a Trumpist. Ultimately, I don't know what Garth Brooks' politics are, but it was an example of that sort of it seemed like trying to be decidedly non-committal about, listen, I just couldn't be there for a scheduling reason. And it seemed very calculated in that sense.
This idea and this narrative, I think, is sort of as old as time at this point. It is not a recent Trump-related phenomenon. I mean, in indie music, most likely the biggest case of this is Morrissey of the Smiths, who for decades and decades and decades, fans have agonized about just how problematic or offensive or ridiculous or out of pocket his views or his opinions are in interview after interview after interview, and it just doesn't seem to get any better. In fact, I would say it seems to get even worse, like with the passage of time. However, I think your average fan who is really emotionally invested in their favorite music, in their favorite artist, they create such a deep personal connection with what that person is making that they ascribe all sorts of very positive and very, very, I would say, like self-paralleled opinions of how that person is, what they think, how they must be. And then when they catch an interview or they meet them in person and they're shocked to find out that they're not a nice person or they hold some heinous points of view, it can be kind of earth-shattering. And what I would recommend to people generally is that even if you enjoy some album like it's changed your life or something like that, don't allow that to lead you to believe that that means the people who made that record are great people or that they hold all of the same opinions that you do. I mean, in most cases, it's probably not going to hold up.
So years ago when you were on, you and I talked about how where music artists get their money has really changed over time, that the idea of like the super lucrative record deal has kind of been replaced by streaming and using notoriety to sell concert tickets, and that it's really just sort of a new business model. So I'm curious, you are aware of the issues that political YouTubers and independent media have been having with monetization on YouTube and the amount of power that advertisers ultimately sort of have over whether, if I talk about Jeffrey Epstein, am I making money or am I not making money on that because of their whims rather than what is serving the public interest? Do you see any parallels between the ways in which large corporations, be it those that determine how many fractions of a penny you get per stream or how many fractions of a penny I get per pre-roll ad, are increasingly in control of culture, politics, news, the sort of water cooler topics that are out there?
I can't say that there's any, from what I've heard and from what I've read, I don't know if there's as much concern around the industry as far as higher ups talking to artists who they've signed to their label in terms of these issues should not be addressed in your music and that sort of thing. I think instantaneously, what matters most is whether or not the streams are there, whether or not the audience engagement is there. If some artist comes on a record and says something absolutely radical or even does a song about the whole Jeffrey Epstein thing, if that track ends up platinum tomorrow, the labels will not care. They'll, okay, that track's platinum. That is, in fact, because they see that pattern, they will try to find ways to recreate that same sensation, because the labels are in a position where they're just constantly chasing after an ever evolving plane of trends. And because there aren't advertisers buying into the music that is, being placed onto Apple Music or Spotify. And of course, these artists do, ad deals, but this is a different discussion. Because there aren't advertisers in the mix, in that equation, we don't necessarily have to be all that concerned about songs or various topics being user friendly. I mean, being advertiser friendly is the word that I'm looking for. So there's not really as much concern on that end, I guess. But I will say in extension of our last conversation, now that labels have mostly figured out the equation when it comes to really making money off of this whole streaming thing, they are now pulling in billion-dollar profits at this point collectively as far as the major labels go. And we are starting to see some of those big multi-million-dollar deals come back with artists like Logic, who I know has made at least one multi-million-dollar deal for his latest batch of records. Brockhampton as well. I'm sure it's continuing with other artists too. But we actually are starting to see some of those deals come back, and we're starting to see them publicized here and there a little bit more too.
When you look at the future of the music industry in the context of corporate control versus independent, what do you see as sort of, for someone who maybe doesn't follow the industry as closely as you do, what are the sort of like big discussions or tipping points that could in the next couple of years push the industry in one way or in a completely different direction?
I think for a while when the internet started to really begin to inch into the profits and the traffic and the attention that the music industry was able to generate interest in through old mediums like magazines and radio and so on and so forth. As soon as the internet started inching in on that, I think we saw a bit of a very short golden-ish era of independence in terms of new writers online and blogs in every which direction that were covering a variety of different artists and musical trends that were just of the interest of the person writing. There wasn't anyone pushing them to do that or anything like that. And sure, that system did have its issues, and I do think it was a little limited in its coverage of a lot of different genres, which is why that blog boom that I'm referring to that happened in the 2000s is like really nowhere at this point. But I think now that major labels and the traditional music media industry, what's left of it, have figured out the internet for the most part, we're starting to slide back into that direction where there is some gatekeeping and there is more corporate control and there is more of a top-down influence on what people are listening to. Overall, I would say it's still way better than what we had a majority of in the 2000s. But still, these days, when it comes to getting play, getting attention, getting an audience for your song or for your record, what was once, I don't know, a positive review in Spin or like in The Source or something like that has become top placement in a Spotify playlist. That's sort of become the new thing. These curators that run and work on these streaming platforms are essentially kind of guiding the tastes of your average music listener who is hopping on Spotify, who's hopping on Apple Music, and is just looking for something that they could put on without having to think too much of it, something that they just play in the background, will provide a little bit of variety without veering too much outside of the norm to the point where it's attention grabbing or interrupts whatever they have going on primarily in the foreground while the music just plays in the background. I've referred to this on a few occasions as the playlistification of music itself, where you hear a lot of weird genre clashes and combinations that I don't think you would have caught previously on albums years and years ago, where you hear predominantly on a lot of major records, a lot of tracks whose production and singing and instrumentation are very pillowy, not so much so that they become ambient, but just enough to where it's catchy, it's sweet, it sort of falls into the background. It's playlists that are able to combine as many songs in this style that end up getting the most play and the most runtime and the most attention, because there's nothing mentally that interrupts the listener in the listening experience of that playlist. And it sort of drives this demand for artists to try to meet those aesthetics in their own music so that they could end up on one of these playlists, or at least appeal to people on that level so that they capture people sort of in that same mindset when a listener is checking out their new album.
Fascinating changes that will no doubt continue. Anthony Fantano, not only the internet's busiest music nerd, but also really a connoisseur of independent progressive media, I think I would say. People may not know that you really are you have your finger on the pulse of what's happening in independent progressive media.
I watch too much of it, honestly. It's I've been a news junkie for a long time. And I went to college and studied, not just journalism and not just broadcast media, but political science itself. I thought out of college I would go into political reporting, but I just ended up kind of sticking with music. But it's, politics and everything going on in that sphere is something I've kept up with for a very long time and have been active in since a teenager at some level or another. And I've been watching your show for a long, long time. I can't remember the last, the first time we emailed was probably earlier in the first leg of this decade. I can't
Years
remember.
Ago. Yeah.
First contact that we had. But I've been on your show. I think yours and Kyle's shows are probably two of the earliest that I caught on YouTube as far as political content on the platform, and still watching today.
Appreciate it so much. Anthony Fantano, internet's busiest music nerd and editor-in-chief of The Needle Drop. Check him out on YouTube, where he has way more subscribers than I do. Anthony, always a pleasure to talk to you.
Not for long, David. Not for long.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
This is really interesting, but also not really surprising, because when we watch presidential debates, including the recent Democratic primary debates on NBC and CNN, respectively, the obvious realization that anyone who watches should come to if they're paying attention is that there are narratives that the networks are deliberately pushing. There are storylines that the networks and their moderators will just crowbar into the debates, and the networks are not playing sort of a bystander role of just facilitating the debate as moderators, as the term moderator would suggest. They're active participants. They're writing the storyline. And before the CNN debate, I believe it was, there were all sorts of teasers and promos on social media and on CNN's website about, will Beto confront Pete Buttigieg or vice versa about something? And it was just such a completely fabricated and bogus narrative, suggesting that the big thing everyone's looking forward to is what's going to happen when Beto and Buttigieg square off. That was a totally fabricated narrative. No one cared about that. But it was a storyline created by corporate media. And the network clearly goes in with a plan. This is not just CNN. To create confrontations. They set up candidates to respond directly to often inaccurately framed quotes from other candidates. They try to force disagreement. They try to get someone to attack somebody else. And it's so obvious and it's so brazen that it's actually pathetic if you understand what's going on. They reinforce the polling by giving the people who are leading more time to talk. And in a sense, I understand that, but it becomes very transparently sensational when you realize that they basically reinforce the polling in terms of speaking time, except if there's a storyline that they want to push that benefits from giving a lower polling candidate more airtime. For example, if a lower polling candidate goes in and is just aggressively attacking others, that's going to get them more speaking time than their polling might suggest, because it's all sensationalized. Okay, that's the setup. So Andrew Yang was on the H3 podcast the other day and straight up said, it's even more rigged than we thought. And honestly, there's no reason to question this whatsoever, because it makes perfect sense. It confirms what seems pretty obvious when you watch the debates. Take a look at this.
One thing I'll share with you all is that some of the campaigns are in touch with the TV network ahead of time to talk about what sort of attack they want to level on the stage.
They're like, an attack on Biden around this question would play really well.
Or yes, the campaign says, hey, we're going to make this attack against Biden. And then the network goes, okay, we get it. And then they help create that opportunity.
What a nightmare. I mean, what a farce.
Yeah, it's quite a disaster. And I want to share with you the perspectives. I think a lay person who happens to find himself on the presidential debate stage being like, what the hell is going on here? What's happening? I'm not on this conference call.
Yeah, so this is just not surprising. I mean, How many problems are there with the debates that we've talked about? Problem number one, the format just doesn't let us learn anything about what the candidates really would do. Important policy questions are expected to be answered in 30 seconds, sometimes rebutted in 15 seconds. It's laughable. And the problem is a lot of people can sound okay in 30 seconds, but really know nothing in depth. So it's actually a disservice to figuring out who knows what they're talking about. Second problem, there are too many candidates. That will get solved soon. That's not really CNN or NBC's fault. That's just a problem that's going to be solved soon. Problem number three, the debates are, as Andrew Yang is saying, rigged to set up candidates for attacks or kill shots at the expense of substantive debate. Number four, as you know, I've talked about, debates need to be public domain, okay? We're picking the president or who is going to run for president. These cannot be for-profit events to be monopolized by one network. This hurts us. As you know, we wanted to do commentary on the CNN debate. They shut us down on YouTube. They gave us a copyright strike. Their VP of who knows what was attacking me on Twitter. So that's bad. But it also allows the networks to turn it into a boxing match effectively rather than an important public service. And this is not just the networks. Obviously, the networks are going to do it, but the DNC, the RNC, the Commission on Presidential Debates, they could all say, we are not going to be complicit. We will insist on a format that is actually better for figuring out who knows what and their positions on issues. We are going to insist as a prerequisite that these be effectively public domain events like the State of the Union address. So yeah, the networks will do what's best for them and for ratings and for clips, and we know that. But the DNC, RNC, and Commission on Presidential Debates are also complicit in it, and that needs to change. So love that Andrew Yang is just saying it the way it is. Not surprising. It seemed pretty obvious just from watching the debates that this is what was going on. But be that as it is, this is what we're dealing with. And these are not events that really let us figure out who would be best at solving issues for the country, who is most knowledgeable in any sort of depth beyond one or two talking points on any of these issues. And it's been a complete disservice to the democratic process, as I've been telling you. Hey, this is sort of weird. Former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee and former U.S. Senator Rick Santorum are hanging out in Russia, and you can join them for $5,000 to $12,000. This is just the strangest and also sort of most classless thing. The two Republicans were just in St. Petersburg, and they've been promoting a cruise. You can go on a cruise with them. This is just so bizarre. It's called the Baltic Experience with Governor Mike Huckabee and guest speaker Senator Rick Santorum. The cruise will stop in St. Petersburg, Russia, Helsinki, Finland, Copenhagen, Denmark, Tallinn, Estonia, Stockholm, Sweden, and more. This is for profit. Tickets are $5,000 to $12,000, depending on, I guess, how much time you want to have with Mike Huckabee or Rick Santorum, and probably what size room you get and what kind of a view you get from that room on the big cruise ship. Huckabee promoted this on his Facebook page as a, quote, unforgettable trip to the Baltics. He talks about the weather, very strange. Huckabee also, I guess, tweeting jokes where he said, enjoy dinner on the Baltic Sea with Jane Huckabee and dear friends Rick and Karen Santorum. Note to the media, we are not here to collude, but to see if we can get the uranium back that Hillary sold. We told Vlad we could be more flexible after the election. And then Huckabee's own wife, who's just a hilarious woman, responding to the tweet, we were colluding. People are actually talking about Russian collusion and Russian connections here. I genuinely don't see it that way. I see this solely as a cringy money grab. Unless you can get me some evidence that this is anything more than that, you don't have to speculate what this is all about. It's just money. Yes, okay, Santorum is connected to that Russian agent, Maria Butina. And yes, it seems like Betsy DeVos was in Russia at the exact same time as Huckabee and Santorum. But I think those are just coincidences. I have no reason to think that this is anything but a brazen money grab from these two. What I really want to know is who's willing to pay $12,000 to go on a boat with Mike Huckabee and Rick Santorum? I'm not being sarcastic. If you know anyone who went on this thing or is going on this thing, please get them in touch with me. What has gone horribly wrong in your life that you feel compelled to pay money to go on a boat to talk to Mike Huckabee and Rick Santorum and hear them speak? That's who I want to talk to. And the only real question mark about this for Santorum and Huckabee, this is just a money grab. And strangely enough, these things are much more widely available than some people might imagine. And some of them are even more cringy than this one. Okay, we have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here is a guy who is very upset, I guess, about Virginia. I genuinely don't even know what they're talking about. Take a listen. This is the type of hate, by the way, we get every day.
Hey, Prickless. How you doing, Prickless? You know what? Your friends at Free Speech TV, that little, you don't even have a hair on your balls. You don't have balls. You got
balls?
A vagina. You got a clitoris. You're an idiot, you liberal.
Oh, I thought there was more. I think he stays on the phone for a while. Like the voicemail is actually still going. Okay, and there he hung up. All right. No response needed, but this is a get out the vote reminder. You're not going to convince that guy to vote for a Democrat. You're not going to convince many of these people to consider something other than Trump. So once again, just get out the vote. There's tens of millions of people who didn't vote last time and who might not vote this time, who already agree with us. Just tell them that they should go and vote because it matters. Because people like this talking about, prickless vaginas and balls, we're not going to convince them. That's very, very clear. On today's bonus show, we will talk about CNN's Chris Cuomo in a video threatening a man who called him Fredo and actually equating the term Fredo to the N-word. Was it a setup? CNN is standing behind him. I have some thoughts. We will also talk about a company stirring debate trying to trademark the concept of Taco Tuesday. Is Taco Tuesday so ubiquitous that it really should be beyond intellectual property protections, the likes of which this company is trying to get? We will discuss that. We will also talk about really strange things going on with this entire Storm Area 51 event that is being planned and promoted. All of those stories and more on today's bonus show. 2 ways to get instant access to the bonus show. Become a member at www.joinpacman.com or become a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. I'll speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.